When I was little, I was madly in love with God. Madly. I talked to God all the time. And when I was falling asleep at night, I would say my prayers and I would say, bless Mom and Dad and everybody, including my model horses and my stuffed animals. And then I would put myself to sleep doing theology. Because even though I was 4, my parents had met at Princeton Seminary, and so theology was sort of in the air that we breathed. My dad dandled me on his knee trying to teach me the Greek alphabet so I could read the New Testament in its original language. I was 18 months old, so I think that was a little early, but it did sound familiar when I got to seminary. And I had been told that God was outside of time. And so I put myself to sleep trying to figure that out. So God is outside of time. That means he can see the past and he can see the future. Well, then why does he act in the Bible like he doesn't know what's going to happen? Why does he ask people to do stuff if he knows they're not going to do it? Is he like manipulative? Although I didn't know that word at 5. Is he just tricking people? And then I would just fall asleep in the middle because, of course, nobody can figure it out. And number 2, theology is soporific. But people think about God all the time and wonder about God. A lot of people, really from the beginning of time, there are images of the Great Mother or fertility symbols. People seemed to have had an experience of the holy, an experience of the numinous. That's the word that Rudolf Otto used in his book, 1917, called The Idea of the Holy, which is one of the big books that got people thinking and talking about the numinous. And how do you talk about an experience of the numinous? How do you talk about a sense of enormous gratitude or being filled with love or awe or dread? And almost all humans have had that experience at one point or another, or will have. And you need language for it because it's common. It's a common experience, so it'd be silly to ignore it, but there's no language that can really pin it down. The ancient Taoist manuscript, the Tao Te Ching, says the Tao which can be named is not the Tao. The nameless one is the one. And so if it doesn't have a name, the people struggle, tongue-tied, to speak of this mystery, and yet you don't want to just give up on speaking of it. So when I was little, I would fall asleep trying to think about time and eternity, which is probably why today movies with time travel and books with time travel in them, I don't even. I'm not going to go. If somebody says, oh, let's go see a movie called Time After Time or whatever, I'm like, does that have time travel in it? Because if it does, I'm not going. And they're almost as bad as movies with monkeys in, which I will not see. But that's another sermon. It's a complete mystery. I have no idea. It's inexplicable. Just freaks me totally out. Even though real monkeys, I'm fine with. When I was in Thailand, real monkeys swinging tree to tree didn't bother me a bit. It's the movies, the movie monkeys. Anyway, I'm starting that other sermon, and that's not the one I wrote. So I loved God to distraction. I loved God, and I could feel myself just overflowing with love for God, and I gradually became aware that it was unrequited. I grew up in a little Presbyterian household where, the Presbyterian God loves you in spite of who you are, which is kind of depressing because I wanted to be loved because I was fabulous, but and because I was such a good girl, I was trying so hard. And yet, all my righteousness was as filthy rags. That was what I was taught. as a little kid, which is why communion in the Presbyterian church or the Reformed tradition comes to you in little tiny cups rather than you going up the aisle like the Episcopalians do to get communion, because you are a wretched sinner and there's no way you can even approach. So give it up and take what comes to you, which is a little cube of tasteless bread and some grape juice, because God forbid it should be wine. And that's another sermon. So I was raised with this God who loved me in spite of all my shortcomings and failings, a God who blesses those who do right and corrects those who do wrong. My will was dangerous, as was my heart. So if I were, as a teenager, get a little card or something that said, follow your heart, my dad would start, the heart is deceitful above all things. You can't follow your heart. Your heart will lead you astray. Anyway, that was a long lecture. And theology was done in my house in such a way as to clobber. So it was like there were so many words that would come at you that you would gradually just nod to make it stop. And the problem of pain was my biggest stumbling block as a child. And why does this God who loves us all let bad things happen? And there are lots of torturous explanations, none of which make God look very good in the Christian theology that I was raised with. But I kept wondering and fighting and struggling with God, which I was taught by my theologian parents was a faithful response to God. The Israelites were always yelling at God. This is what people who love God do. You yell at God because God's not doing the way you think God should do, and that's how you grow or something. And so I was angry at God because my parents were getting a divorce, and I was angry at God because after that my mother got cancer, and after that the Christians around my mother started acting really badly, in that they would say, you can't pray for her because you're in seminary and you have doubts, and so if you have doubts and you pray for her, she won't be healed, so you need to leave the room while we pray for your mother's healing, which I'm still mad about at some level. But I'm letting it go gradually, and I'll be a better person like next week. And my dad gave me a wonderful book by the theologian C.S. Lewis called The Problem of Pain. And it made a lot of sense, and it said that most evil in the world happens because of natural law and human free will. Human people do terrible things, and the rain comes and washes your house away. And the fire comes and burns things up, and the moths come and eat through your favorite pashmina and whatever. So natural law is where I'm being flippant about the pashmina, I'm sorry. That's not real human suffering. I know that. And so the problem of pain says natural law has to remain constant, because if you have a 2x4, a piece of lumber, you need it to be what it is in order to build your house with it. And if you're going to hit someone over the head with it, it can't suddenly change into a limp, wet noodle of spaghetti so as not to do any harm. It stays the way it is, and it stays what it is, and it's how you use it that makes the pain. And so a lot of that made sense to me, except that the people around me kept talking as if God did occasionally intervene in natural law. So that's where the problem comes. If there were natural law and nobody ever intervened and it always went the way it goes, then you don't have really a problem. But if there are miracles sometimes and not other times, that's when you start with the problem. Because why? Why heal some people and not other people? Why save one city from the big hurricane and not another city from the big hurricane? Why does the hurricane come right here through New Orleans or through Houston and not another place? And they say it's because they're all the gay people in New Orleans. And then I think it looks to me like God is punishing the oil industry. But what do I know? So my problem is that I want to be able to feel blessed and grateful to God, to the universe, just in general. The universe is a way that some people speak about the divine that doesn't take it outside of nature. It's part of nature, which is a little more palatable to me. But there's still the problem of why bad things happen and why does there seem to be a miracle every now and then or a coincidence that doesn't make sense. And I know you mathematicians, coincidences are statistically more likely to happen than non-coincidences. Somebody tried to explain this to me one time, but I fell asleep halfway through. I have told some of you all about the workshop at General Assembly where I was with. It was a workshop just for ministers, and so there were 200 of us in a room, and we brainstormed about all kinds of ideas of God. So there's the biblical God who is a creator and then who is in history and makes has a relationship with history and with people, and is outside of nature. And then there is the Aristotle's unmoved mover who just got everything going somehow and then backed off for some reason. There's no real why in any of that. And then there's the God is in everything. So God is in not only the dolphins at sunset, which makes some people believe in God, but also the cancer cell and the animals eating each other and nature red and tooth and claw. And God is in that too. If you're going to go with God is in everything, God has to be in the bad stuff too. So that's a problem. Then there's the God is everything, like the Hindu sense of God is being. And if anything has being, that's the God in there. Atman is being. So if you have being, you have God in there, which makes a lot of sense too. And then there's there is no God. So they divided us up. They said, all of you who believe this one, go to this table, this one, go to this table, blah, blah, blah. And at the there is no God table, there were 4 elderly retired Unitarian ministers who all looked like long-distance runners and had twinkly blue eyes and good hair. And they were laughing the whole time. And the 150 of us that were around the table of God is in everything, we were trying to talk to each other and wrestle, and we were having the best time. We're pulling out our whole vocabulary and all our seminary training, and it's great. We could just say whatever we wanted, and we were trying to figure it out. Why is there evil was the question that everybody was supposed to be working on. So we started wrestling with why is there evil. The 4 atheist ministers kept laughing. The other people were wrestling too. And then we had a report time at the end where one person from every table, you know how that goes, reports. And we reported our tortured journey toward whatever we had figured out. And one of the guys from the There Is No God table came up to the microphone and he said, well, if there's no God, there's no problem, so we just talked about golf. So, my desire for this congregation is that what we don't believe becomes just a small way station on the journey to what we do believe. A lot of people get started in Unitarian Universalism. The ones who aren't born to it are started here because you start losing things you believed, or you don't believe certain things anymore, or you believe things that are not acceptable to the church of your childhood. So you end up in Unitarian Universalism, but a lot of people get stuck there and identify themselves by what they don't believe anymore. But really, there's almost nobody who's that interested in what you don't believe here. So what you do believe is much more interesting. And even though what you don't believe still shocks Aunt Mabel and would cause havoc at the Thanksgiving dinner table, here it's just like, yeah, nobody believes that. What do you believe? So you may let go of the God who messes around in history. You may let go of the God who is arbitrary and judgmental and loves you if you do well and doesn't love you if you do badly, which is nowhere in the Bible, by the way. You may let go of the God who somehow allowed the ecological disasters in Japan and Louisiana, somehow allowed the plane in Indonesia just now to go down, somehow allowed bad things to happen. You may let go of that God who's really in control of everything, but sometimes inexplicably allows terrible things to happen. You may let go of the God who is supposed to be love, and yet, here's the world that we live in. Or you may hang on to that God and decide that that God is better than nothing, or that that God is your God, and then by goodness, by God, you're going to be right there wrestling with him. And you might be like the Jews in Elie Wiesel's book, who, after seeing the death of a child in the camps, had a meeting and put God on trial. And God had a lawyer, and the child had a lawyer, and they argued, and the jury finally declared God guilty. And then they broke for evening prayers. Because what else do you do? The God in the Unitarian tradition, and the Universalist tradition, is love. God being love is the standard by which you measure any other declarations or statements about God. And if they don't go with that, then you let go of them. So I've told you about the songwriter from Lubbock that I heard on NPR who said, yeah, as a child we learned two things about God. We learned God loves you and he'll send you straight to hell. And then we learned that sex is evil, dirty, and dangerous, and you should save it for the one you love. So then if God is love, then what does that mean? You can read William Ellery Channing's Baltimore sermon. Just Google the Baltimore sermon, and it'll come up. And that was a longer sermon than we have in this congregation so far. And you will read a lot about that particular image of God. But right now in Unitarian Universalism, there's such a range of beliefs about God, from belief in the biblical God, who is the God of history and who redeems people through the story of sacrifice and through the actual sacrifice, and to there is no God and it's stupid. Anybody who believes in God is stupid. There is everything in between. God is mystery. God is the life force, like the force in Dylan Thomas's poem, the force which through the green fuse drives the flower. This is the force of life, the energy of life. Some people call that God. Some people call God the interdependent web of all existence. So everything is connected, and we use science and physics to understand as much as we can understand and look forward to understanding the rest. And that interconnectedness is what we call God. Some people call love God and just say God is love, and there's a force of love. And then there are the transcendentalists who painted a picture of the one soul of all things, that everything is connected, everything has one soul, and that is, they called it the oversoul, and that is what they relate to as if it were what people call God. Now, the syllable God is a syllable that is problematic for some people. It carries a lot of baggage. It's delightful for other people. For other people, it's kind of neutral. Really, it's just poetry. And if you don't become literal about it, that's always hard for me. I'm a pretty literal-minded person. So going to poetry is always a leap for me. I have to remind myself not to be literal. And so when you say God, you're really speaking poetically of this, whatever you see as the most basic, most valued element. The ground of being is what Paul Tillich called it. The mother goddess is what some call it. Some people see it as the earth. Some people see it as the universe. There are so many ways of seeing this, and so many names to call it, that usually I don't use the word God. I feel about the word God a little tiny sliver of the way I feel about it is the way I feel about the flag that was over the State House in South Carolina, in that it is a symbol. It is a symbol that has been co-opted by so many people and used in such terrible ways that it might be best just to take it down, fold it, put it away in a museum. And yet, as I argue with myself about it, the syllable God has also done a lot of wonderful good in the world, unlike that flag. And so God has inspired people to build hospitals and take care of children and reform the mental health industry so far as it has been. And God inspires many people to beautiful actions. So perhaps I don't have to take it down and fold it away and put it in a museum, although I just particularly don't like to use it all that much. I mostly say the divine or the mystery, and that seems broader to me. When I actually think about what I actually believe about God, I think to myself, I believe in a stream of love that runs through the universe. And I think that maybe how it got created, maybe this is too literal again, is that every act of love between an animal parent and a child, or human, between humans, between animals, however the love is expressed in all of the world, that love leaves a little trace energy, and that energy stays, and that it gathers and grows, and that we are now building God, and that the more people who do the more loving things, God gets bigger. And so God is, in a sense, in us and also outside of us, and that you can align yourself with that river of love or not. But the lack in that is, where's the justice in that? Although I think that love does lead to justice, many people prefer a picture of God that's much more proactive toward the poor and oppressed, and I understand that. So I think the proactivity toward the poor and oppressed is us, that God, river, spirit, whatever you see as God, doesn't have hands here on the earth. The only hands God has are our hands. The only hands the mystery has are ours. The only engine of desire to change things is our engine of desire. And as we gather together, we build that and make it bigger. So I'm interested to know which of these views of God speak to you, and whether you want to be a neo-transcendentalist and believe, yeah, there's a neo-transcendentalist right there. Go, baby. And believe in the connection between all things and the one soul of all things. That makes a lot of sense to me. And our forebears used Buddhist and Hindu scriptures, as well as Christian and Jewish scriptures, as well as the love of nature and their own experience to build that idea. And I think it's a good one for me. But welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church, where no discussion is ever finished, and where what you don't believe is just a way station on the way to what you do believe, and where all of your searches for truth and meaning are supported by the community, or should be.